My name is Mike Foley. I'm a professional civil engineer. I'm a proud graduate of HP Baldwin High School here in Maui, so it's a pleasure to be with you all today, and thank you for having me. I prepared a couple notes here, but as was mentioned, I'm kind of on the front lines of climate change in terms of my work in the coastal zone. So as a coastal engineer, I deal a lot with the unsustainable management of our coastlines and kind of the high hazard that's set up for the greater public in Hawaii. And it's mainly Maui, Oahu, and Kauai that are dealing with increased hazards in our coastline, and it's getting worse daily, no doubt. I did my PhD at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and I was specializing in research on the design of artificial reefs, or in engineering terms, submerged breakwater structures that could be applied to the coastal zone as another tool of restoring and stabilizing eroding coastlines. And at the same time, creating habitat for the reef ecosystem, as well as recreational benefits for surfers, for divers. So it's one of the tools that I've been promoting along with beach restoration, so bringing sand, bringing back dunes and native plants to the coastal zone and trying to rehabilitate these areas that we've lost. So in terms of what I'm seeing on the front lines of climate change, so we definitely have an erosion problem that's accelerating. It's not only impacting private property owners, hotels. You probably see a lot of these things on the news. It's our roads, of course, the highways, our county roads, public parks all over the state. Ho'okipa Beach Park, I was just talking with Auntie, and there's EV that are being exposed kind of on the daily on the North Shore, and it basically impacts all of us, whether or not we live on the coast or just enjoy the coastline, or we have friends that enjoy the coastline, or if it's a cultural aspect of your life. In terms of metrics, we were kind of asked to think a little bit about the metrics and how we can kind of help guide maybe investments in terms of what we could measure to see how much of a benefit these projects can actually have to address some of these problems. So I'm an engineer, so I love to think about numbers and what it ultimately comes down to in the bottom line. So an interesting metric in terms of the overall global challenge that we face is, of course, water level, right? That's something we can measure daily, and we do. We actually measure it on a very consistent basis in Kahului Harbor with our tide gauges. And so what we're seeing is we already have sea level rise. And of course, you know, the projections for sea level rise are quite scary. But what we're seeing and what we just saw, the day after Christmas, we had a water level that was 3.5 feet above low tide. That's 9 inches higher than we ever expected for that particular day. So that right there is sea level rise, right? So we have 9 inches of extra water. Whether or not that's the global trend of, you know, the oceans just having more water, or if it's more of a local effect, the ocean scientists don't really know at this point. But we know that it was unexpected, and that the impact of that extra water level was quite devastating to some coastal properties. So sea level rise is here, it's happening now, and we can measure it. By 2050, we think we're going to see an extra 3 feet of sea level rise. So if just 9 inches caused all this damage, you can imagine what 3 feet would do. So in terms of what we're going to do in a metric to kind of measure our success. So we can, of course, measure sea level, and we can get a sense of our global ability to change the global problem, which at this point we've had little success in, unfortunately. In terms of our local ability to adapt to this changing climate, There's strategies that we can undertake. I mentioned kind of beach restoration, but the number now, the bottom line is we have 80% of Maui's beaches are eroding. So we're losing beach every day. And that has an impact, of course. We can keep track of these things. We have coastal scientists, the University of Hawaii is out there. We have Maui counties that are keeping track of these things. Citizen scientists are taking pictures. We know that we can address these and we can sustainably manage our coastlines. And so a metric might be how much of that 80% of eroding coastline do we actually have a plan for? And that plan is actually funded so that we can get out there and do things like build dunes, plant the morning glory of the ahiaki grass, bring back some of the native vegetation that we need to stabilize. How many of these coastlines are we actually going to be able to move houses out of that zone, move roads? How many of these places do we actually have a plan that's funded and that we can actually start implementing and holding people accountable at the state, at the county, and at the private level?